November 16, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Stark, a hastily constructed prisoner-of-war facility nestled in the pine forests of northern New Hampshire. Inside the canvas-covered vehicle, 27 German women sat in rigid silence, their faces pale beneath the dim afternoon light filtering through the fabric. They wore the remnants of their gray auxiliary uniforms, now stained with mud and sweat from the Atlantic crossing and the long journey from the port in Boston. 32-year-old Irma Hoffman pressed her back against the wooden bench, feeling every bump in the unpaved road. Her hands, once smooth from her work as a radio operator in occupied France, now bore calluses from weeks of manual labor aboard the military transport ship. She glanced at the younger women around her, some barely 18 years old, their eyes reflecting the same mixture of fear and exhaustion that she felt deep in her bones. The truck lurched to a stop. Through the canvas opening, Irma caught her first glimpse of the compound. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across a clearing, surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with coils of wire that glinted in the weak November sun. Guard towers stood at each corner, their silhouettes dark against the gray sky. Everything looked temporary, hastily assembled, as if the Americans themselves weren't quite sure what to do with female prisoners of war. "Raus, out!" The voice came from outside, speaking German with a thick American accent. The women exchanged glances but didn't move immediately. They had learned during their capture to wait, to watch, to anticipate violence even when none seemed imminent. A guard pulled back the canvas, revealing a young American soldier who couldn't have been more than 25 years old. He had kind eyes, Irma noticed with surprise, not the cold hatred she had been taught to expect from the enemy. He gestured toward the opening, repeating his command more gently this time. One by one the women climbed down from the truck, their legs stiff from hours of sitting. Irma's boots touched American soil for the first time, and she felt a strange disconnection from reality. Just 6 months ago, she had been celebrating what Nazi propaganda promised would be Germany's inevitable victory. Now she stood in enemy territory, a prisoner in a foreign land, facing an uncertain future that terrified her more than she wanted to admit. Standing near the camp's administrative building was a woman in American military uniform. Captain Sarah Mitchell, as Irma would later learn, watched the new arrivals with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy but wasn't cruelty either. Something in between. Something Irma didn't have words for yet. The November wind cut through their thin uniforms, and several of the younger women shivered visibly. Irma straightened her shoulders, determined to maintain some dignity even in defeat. The women were led in a single-file line toward the largest barracks, their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. Irma observed everything with the trained eye of someone who had spent years gathering intelligence for the Wehrmacht. The guard towers were manned but not heavily armed. The fencing was secure but not impenetrable. Most notably, the American soldiers who watched their procession seemed more curious than hostile, their expressions lacking the triumphant cruelty she had been conditioned to expect. Inside the barracks, rows of metal cots lined both walls, each covered with a thin mattress and 2 wool blankets folded with military precision. A pot-bellied stove occupied the center of the room, radiating modest heat that barely touched the cold air seeping through gaps in the wooden walls. 27 beds for 27 women. They had been counted, accounted for, assigned spaces in this temporary world. Captain Mitchell stood at the entrance, a young woman with brown hair pulled back in a tight bun, serving as her translator. "You will remain here until further processing," the translator said in perfect German. "Roll call is at 0600 hours. Meals are served at 0700, 1200, and 1800 hours. You are permitted to move freely within the compound during daylight hours, but must return to this barracks by 2100 hours." The translator paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed. You will be fed. You will receive medical care if needed." She spoke these words as if she understood that the German women wouldn't believe them, as if she knew that trust would have to be earned rather than declared. After the Americans left, silence settled over the barracks like snow. Irma chose a cot near the stove and sat down, the metal frame creaking under her weight. Around her, the other women began claiming their own spaces, moving with the quiet efficiency of people too tired for conversation. Beside Irma, A young blonde woman who looked barely old enough to have served in the auxiliary corps sat down heavily on the adjacent cot. Her name tag read, Weber, Anna Weber. She stared at her hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "Do you think they're telling the truth?" Anna whispered in German, her voice barely audible. "About the Geneva Convention?" Irma didn't answer immediately. She had heard stories about American brutality from Nazi propaganda, but she had also heard whispered counter-narratives from soldiers who had actually fought against the Americans in North Africa and Italy. Stories that contradicted everything the Reich wanted them to believe. "I don't know," Irma finally replied, her honesty surprising even herself. "I suppose we'll find out." Outside, the November afternoon faded into early darkness. The women lay on their cots, fully dressed, unwilling to make themselves vulnerable by removing their uniforms. They listened to the unfamiliar sounds of an American military camp and wondered what the morning would bring. The first week passed in a fog of routine and uncertainty. Each morning began with roll call in the compound yard, where the women stood in neat rows, while American guards counted them with clipboards and tired efficiency. The Americans tried speaking to them in broken German, but the prisoners responded only with their names and prisoner numbers, offering nothing more. Irma noticed how the younger women looked to her for guidance. Perhaps because of her age or the calm demeanor she forced herself to maintain despite her own internal turmoil. She established unspoken rules that the others followed instinctively. They spoke only German among themselves. They kept their eyes downcast when passing guards. They accepted their meals in silence and ate together at one end of the mess hall, creating an invisible barrier between themselves and their captors. The food itself was strange and abundant. Thick slices of white bread, nothing like the dark rye they were accustomed to. Eggs scrambled with milk until they were fluffy and yellow. Coffee that was weak by German standards but plentiful. Meat at almost every meal, which seemed impossible given that Germany had been rationing meat for years. The portions were generous to the point of wastefulness, and Irma found herself unable to finish everything on her plate, despite the hunger that had become her constant companion during the final months in France. Anna Weber struggled more than most. She picked at her food, her face pale and drawn. During their third night in the barracks, Irma woke to the sound of quiet crying. In the darkness, she could make out Anna's form, curled up on her cot, shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Irma rose and moved silently to the younger woman's bedside. She sat down without asking permission and placed a hand on Anna's shoulder. "You're thinking about home," she whispered in German. Anna nodded, unable to speak. Finally she managed, "My mother, my little brother. I don't even know if they're still alive. Hamburg was bombed so many times." Other women were awake now, listening in the darkness. This was the first time any of them had spoken about what they had lost, what waited for them back in Germany. The silence that followed Anna's words was heavy with shared grief and fear. "We can't think about that now," Irma said quietly, though her own heart ached with thoughts of her family in Berlin. "We have to survive each day, that's all we can do." But survival meant more than just breathing. It meant maintaining their identity as German women, as soldiers of the Reich, even in defeat. It meant not allowing themselves to be softened by American kindness, if indeed that's what it was, and not some elaborate trap. The days blended together. Morning roll call, breakfast, long hours of enforced idleness, lunch, more waiting, dinner, evening confinement. The Americans didn't ask them to work, didn't interrogate them beyond basic administrative questions. They simply kept them fed and housed and separate, as if unsure what else to do with women warriors who no longer had a war. The temperature dropped sharply during the second week of their captivity. December arrived with biting winds that found every crack in the barracks walls, turning their sleeping quarters into an icebox despite the pot-bellied stove that burned constantly. The women huddled in their bunks, wrapped in their issued blankets, but the cold seemed to seep into their bones regardless. Anna's cough started on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, it had worsened into a deep, rattling sound that echoed through the barracks during the night hours. Irma watched with growing concern as the younger woman's face flushed with fever, her body shaking with chills even when pressed close to the stove. During morning roll call, Anna could barely stand. She swayed on her feet, her lips taking on a bluish tint that Irma recognized from her time nursing wounded soldiers in France. This wasn't just a common cold, this was something that could become dangerous very quickly. Private Michael Whitmore was the guard on duty that morning. He was younger than most of the other soldiers, perhaps 22 or 23, with red hair that stuck out beneath his cap and freckles across his nose that made him look even younger. Irma had noticed him before because, unlike some of the other guards who stared at the German women with open curiosity or barely concealed hostility, he seemed uncomfortable with his role as jailer. He noticed Anna immediately. His eyes widened with concern as she stumbled, and Irma caught her before she fell. Without asking permission or consulting his superiors, Private Whitmore broke ranks and approached them. "She's sick," he said in English, then fumbled for the German word. "Krank?" Irma nodded, supporting Anna's weight. "Ja, sehr krank. Very sick." What happened next surprised everyone. Private Whitmore didn't bark orders or summon the camp doctor. Instead, he disappeared into the nearest building and returned minutes later with an armful of supplies. Extra blankets, thick military-issue ones that were far warmer than what the women had been given. A thermos of hot tea. And small white tablets that he pantomimed were medicine for fever. He approached slowly, as if afraid the German women might scatter like wild animals. When he reached Irma and Anna, he carefully draped one of the blankets around Anna's shoulders. "Hospital," he said, pointing toward the medical building. "Doctor." But Anna shook her head violently, her fever-bright eyes wide with fear. The other women pressed closer, forming a protective circle. They had all heard stories, whispered tales of prisoners who were taken to medical facilities and never returned. Propaganda or truth, none of them knew, but the fear was real enough. Private Whitmore seemed to understand. He didn't insist. Instead, he handed Irma the thermos and medicine, demonstrating how much Anna should take. Then he did something that would be talked about among the women for weeks afterward. He smiled. Not a triumphant smile or a mocking one, but a genuine expression of concern and kindness. "Rest," he said softly. "Better soon." Anna's fever broke after 3 days of rest, the medicine and extra blankets working their quiet magic. She recovered slowly, her cough fading to an occasional rasp, her color returning to something approaching healthy. The women spoke in whispers about Private Whitmore's kindness, trying to reconcile it with everything they had been taught about American soldiers. December settled over Camp Stark like a heavy quilt. Snow began falling on the 3rd day of the month, transforming the compound into something almost beautiful. The pine trees beyond the fence wore coats of white, and the guard towers looked less menacing when dusted with frost. The women watched the snow through the barracks windows, each flake a reminder of homes they might never see again. Irma found herself thinking more and more about her family in Berlin. Her husband Kurt had been killed at Stalingrad 2 years ago, but her mother and younger sister still lived in their apartment near the Tiergarten. Or at least they had when Irma was deployed to France. The bombing campaigns had intensified since then. She had no way of knowing if they were still alive, if the building still stood, if there was anything left to return to. The Americans seemed unsure how to handle the approaching holiday season. Captain Mitchell visited the barracks more frequently, her translator always at her side. She asked careful questions about the women's health, their needs, whether they required anything additional. The prisoners answered in monosyllables, maintaining their wall of resistance even as that wall began developing small cracks. Private Whitmore continued his quiet acts of kindness. He brought extra coal for the stove on particularly cold mornings. He left a stack of old American magazines near the barracks door, publications filled with colorful advertisements and photographs of a country that seemed impossibly wealthy and wasteful to women who had grown up during Germany's economic struggles. Some of the younger women looked through them when they thought no one was watching, their fingers tracing images of American families gathered around elaborate Christmas trees. On December 10th, Captain Mitchell made an unusual announcement during morning roll call. Her translator spoke clearly, enunciating each German word with precision. "In 2 weeks, on Christmas Eve, the camp will hold a special meal. You are invited to attend. There will be extra rations and a small celebration." The women exchanged glances. A celebration? Here? In a prisoner of war camp? It seemed absurd, possibly dangerous. Irma's mind immediately went to darker possibilities. What if this was a trap? What if they were being gathered for some purpose they couldn't yet understand? But Anna, still weak from her illness but recovering, whispered to Irma after they were dismissed. "Do you think they really mean it? A celebration?" "I don't know what they mean," Irma replied honestly. "Americans are strange. Everything about this place is strange." That evening, as the women prepared for sleep, conversation flowed more freely than it had since their arrival. They talked about Christmas traditions from their childhoods, before the war consumed everything. Stollen, the traditional German Christmas bread, Tannenbaum decorations made from whatever materials could be found, carols sung in churches that might now be rubble. December 22nd arrived with heavy snowfall that blanketed the compound in pristine white. The women had grown somewhat accustomed to their routine over the past 5 weeks, though comfort remained elusive. They still maintained their careful distance from the Americans, still spoke primarily in German, still treated each day as something to be endured rather than lived. That morning, Captain Mitchell appeared at the barracks door earlier than usual, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Behind her stood Private Whitmore and 2 other guards, along with several men in cook's uniforms that the women didn't recognize. The translator stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Good morning," she began in German. "Captain Mitchell has an announcement regarding the Christmas meal in 2 days." The women gathered closer, their curiosity overcoming their usual reticence. Irma positioned herself near the front, her eyes fixed on the captain's face, trying to read intentions in the American woman's features. "The kitchen staff has been working to prepare something special for you," the translator continued. "A traditional American Christmas meal. We wanted to inform you of what to expect so that you would understand this is meant as a gesture of goodwill in keeping with the spirit of the holiday season." One of the cooks stepped forward, a heavy-set man with a kind face and flour-dusted apron. Through the translator, he began describing the planned menu. "There will be roasted turkey, which is a large bird, similar to goose but different, mashed potatoes with butter and cream, green beans with almonds, fresh baked bread rolls." He paused, his eyes lighting up with obvious pride in his craft. "And the main dish, what we Americans consider our greatest comfort food, meatloaf with brown gravy." The translator stumbled slightly over the words, clearly uncertain how to convey the concept in German. "Fleischleib mit brauner Soße," she finally said, though the translation sounded awkward and incomplete. The women looked at each other with confusion. Fleischleib? A loaf made of meat, with gravy poured over it? The description made little sense. In Germany, they had Sauerbraten and Schnitzel, Rouladen and Grand, Rouladen, but a loaf fashioned from ground meat and served with gravy? This was entirely foreign to their culinary understanding. "It's a special dish," the cook continued enthusiastically through the translator, "made with the finest beef and pork, mixed with breadcrumbs and eggs, seasoned with herbs, then baked until perfect. The gravy is made from the drippings, rich and savory. It's what American families serve at important gatherings, what mothers make when they want their children to feel loved and cared for." Anna leaned close to Irma and whispered, "It sounds like something for a grand feast, like what they served at the officers' mess during Oktoberfest celebrations." Other women murmured similar thoughts. The Americans were planning something elaborate, something reserved for special occasions. This meatloaf must be their version of a holiday roast, their equivalent of the special meals German families prepared for Christmas Eve. Captain Mitchell spoke directly, and the translator conveyed her words. "We want you to understand that despite the circumstances that brought you here, we recognize your humanity. This meal is our way of acknowledging the season and treating you with the dignity that all people deserve." Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, the morning sun reflecting off snow-covered ground with almost painful brilliance. The women woke earlier than usual, anxiety and anticipation mixing in equal measure. They spent extra time smoothing their uniforms, combing their hair, preparing themselves as if for an important occasion. If the Americans were offering them a special holiday feast, they would accept it with dignity and proper respect. Irma helped Anna braid her blonde hair, weaving it into the traditional style worn by young German women. Around them, others engaged in similar preparations. They had so little, owned nothing beyond the clothes they wore and the few personal items they had managed to keep through capture and transport. But they could at least present themselves properly. At 1100 hours, Private Whitmore appeared at the barracks door. He had traded his usual work uniform for a cleaner dress uniform, and his boots were freshly polished. "Ready?" he asked in his halting German, then smiled encouragingly. "Special day. Good food." The women filed out in orderly lines, their breath visible in the December air. As they walked toward the mess hall, Irma noticed decorations she hadn't seen before. Someone had strung pine branches along the building's entrance, creating a simple wreath. Paper snowflakes hung in the windows, clearly cut by hand with careful precision, small touches that suggested genuine effort rather than mere obligation. Inside the mess hall, the transformation was even more remarkable. The usual stark tables had been covered with white cloth, and small arrangements of pine branches and red berries served as centerpieces. The American flag hung at one end of the room, but there were no swastikas to burn, no German symbols to remove. The Americans had simply created a space that was neutral, almost peaceful. Captain Mitchell stood near the serving line, dressed in her formal uniform. "Welcome," she said through the translator. "Please, sit anywhere you're comfortable." The women chose tables together, maintaining their group cohesion even in this unusual circumstance. They sat with straight backs and folded hands, waiting with the patience of people trained in military protocol. The smell wafting from the kitchen was rich and savory, foreign but not unpleasant. Then the cooks began bringing out the food. Large platters of sliced turkey, golden brown and steaming, bowls of mashed potatoes so fluffy they looked like clouds, green beans with slivered almonds glistening with butter, fresh rolls still warm from the oven. The abundance was almost overwhelming to women who remembered years of rationing and scarcity. But when the meatloaf appeared, the women fell completely silent. It came out on enormous serving platters, sliced into thick portions that revealed the meat's tender interior. The brown gravy was poured over each slice with generous ceremony, pooling on the plates and running down the sides in rich rivulets. The presentation was simple but somehow elegant, the kind of care that spoke to importance and celebration. Anna's eyes widened. "Look at how much there is," she whispered to Irma. "They've prepared enough for a banquet." Around them, other women murmured similar observations. This meatloaf, this strange American dish they had never encountered before, must be extraordinarily special to warrant such elaborate presentation. The American cooks moved among the tables, serving generous portions to each woman. Irma watched as a thick slice of meatloaf was placed on her plate, the brown gravy cascading over it like a waterfall. The cook added mashed potatoes, turkey, green beans, and 2 fresh rolls, until her plate was fuller than any meal she had seen since before the war began. She looked down at the food, then around at her fellow prisoners. Every face reflected the same confusion and wonder. This was meant to be a holiday feast, clearly. The Americans wouldn't serve something ordinary on Christmas Eve, not with this much ceremony and preparation. This meatloaf must be their equivalent of sauerbraten or rouladen, something families prepared only for the most important celebrations. Anna lifted her fork with reverence, as if approaching something sacred. She cut a small piece of the meatloaf, the meat yielding easily under her knife. Steam rose from the interior, carrying the scent of herbs and seasoning that was different from German cooking but not unpleasant. She brought the fork to her lips slowly, aware that all the women at her table were watching her first taste, her eyes closed as she chewed. A moment later, they opened wide with surprise. "It's delicious," she whispered in German. "It's so tender, so flavorful. I've never tasted anything quite like it." The pronouncement spread through the mess hall like wildfire. Women began eating, their initial hesitation giving way to genuine appreciation. The meatloaf was indeed extraordinary in its simplicity. The texture was unlike any German meat dish, somehow both dense and light, holding together perfectly while melting on the tongue. The gravy added richness and depth, complementing rather than overwhelming the meat's natural flavor. Irma took her first bite and understood immediately why this was considered special. There was love in this dish, care in its preparation. Someone had taken time to season it perfectly, to cook it until it reached exactly the right consistency, to create gravy that enhanced rather than masked the meat's quality. This was food made by people who understood that cooking could be an expression of affection and respect. Around the room, the women ate with a hunger that went beyond physical need. They were tasting something they hadn't experienced in years: abundance without guilt, flavor without rationing, food prepared with genuine care rather than necessity. Some of the younger women had tears in their eyes, though whether from the food itself or the memories it evoked was impossible to say. Captain Mitchell moved among the tables, not hovering but checking that everyone had enough. "More?" she asked through the translator when she noticed empty plates. "Please, there is plenty. This is a day for eating well." The women accepted second helpings, something that would have been unthinkable in wartime Germany. Irma found herself eating until she was genuinely full, a sensation so foreign after years of carefully rationed meals that it felt almost uncomfortable. But it was a good discomfort, a reminder of what normal life might feel like. Private Whitmore stood near the kitchen door, watching the German women eat with satisfaction on his young face. When Anna caught his eye, she smiled tentatively and nodded her thanks. He returned the gesture, his expression softening with something that looked almost like relief. The meal lasted nearly 2 hours, far longer than the usual rushed affairs in the mess hall. As plates were cleared, and the women sat back in their chairs, fuller than they had been in years, something unexpected happened. One of the younger prisoners, a girl named Helga who had served as a typist in Brussels, raised her hand tentatively as if still in a classroom. Captain Mitchell noticed and approached her table. "Yes?" the translator conveyed. Helga's cheeks flushed pink, but she pushed forward with her question in halting English. "This meatloaf is very special, yes? For Christmas only?" The translator looked puzzled for a moment, then turned to Captain Mitchell. A brief conversation followed in English that the German women couldn't fully understand, though Irma caught fragments of words. The captain's eyebrows rose in surprise, then her face softened into something that might have been amusement or perhaps gentle sympathy. "No," the translator finally responded in German. "Meatloaf is not just for holidays. American families eat it regularly. Perhaps once a week, sometimes more often. It's considered everyday comfort food." A stunned silence fell over the mess hall. The women looked at each other, then back at their empty plates, trying to process this information. What they had believed was a grand festive dish, something reserved for the most important celebrations, was actually ordinary fare in American households? Anna leaned toward Irma, her voice barely a whisper. "Once a week? They eat like this once a week?" Another woman, older and more weathered, spoke up. "But the meat, the portions, how can ordinary people afford this?" The cook who had prepared the meal stepped forward, understanding the question even before the translation was complete. "Through the interpreter," he explained. "In America, food is abundant. Even during wartime, we all have enough. Meat is rationed, yes, but not like in Europe. Most families can still afford to eat well. Meatloaf became popular because it stretches ground meat further while still tasting good. It's economical but satisfying." The concept was almost incomprehensible to women who had grown up during Germany's economic depression, who had watched their country struggle through years of rationing, who had seen children go hungry while the party elite feasted. The idea that ordinary American workers ate meat weekly, that this abundance was normal rather than exceptional, challenged everything they had been taught about American poverty and weakness. Irma found herself asking a question she hadn't intended to voice. "And before the war? Was it the same?" "Better," the cook replied honestly. "Before rationing, we had even more. But yes, even now, most American families eat reasonably well. It's not luxury, it's just normal life." The women sat in contemplative silence. This single revelation about meatloaf had opened a crack in the wall of propaganda they had built their understanding upon. If the Americans had lied about their poverty and deprivation, what else had been false? If ordinary workers here ate better than German officers, what did that say about the society they had been fighting to defend? Private Whitmore, sensing the shift in atmosphere, began helping clear tables. As he reached for Irma's plate, she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said in careful English, "for good food." His face lit up with surprise and pleasure. "You're welcome," he replied, then added in his broken German, "Frohe Weihnachten." Merry Christmas. The days following Christmas were marked by a subtle but unmistakable shift in the camp's atmosphere. The women no longer sat in complete silence during meals. Conversations in mixed German and broken English could be heard, halting and awkward but genuine. The wall of separation that had existed between prisoners and guards began showing more cracks, each small interaction widening the gaps in their mutual distrust. Irma found herself thinking constantly about the Meatloaf revelation. It seemed like such a small thing, a simple misunderstanding about food. But it had exposed something far larger, the vast gulf between what they had been told about America and the reality they were now witnessing. She had been taught that Americans were weak, decadent, suffering from economic collapse and moral decay. Yet here they were, feeding their prisoners better than most German citizens had eaten in years. Anna began spending more time near the kitchen, drawn by curiosity about American cooking. The head cook, whose name they learned was Thomas, seemed pleased by her interest. He showed her how to make biscuits from scratch, demonstrated the proper way to brew American coffee, explained the difference between various cuts of meat. She absorbed everything with the eagerness of someone discovering that the world was far larger and more complex than she had imagined. One afternoon in early January, as snow fell steadily outside, Captain Mitchell called a general assembly in the mess hall. The women gathered with the usual mixture of anxiety and curiosity, wondering what announcement would come next. The translator stood ready, her expression more serious than usual. "I want to be honest with you about something," Captain Mitchell began, her words carefully translated. "We've received reports from Europe, from Germany. The Allied forces are advancing into your homeland, and what they're finding is disturbing." She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "There are camps. Not prisoner-of-war camps like this one, but something else entirely. Places where civilians were sent. Jewish people, political prisoners, others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The conditions in these camps are beyond anything we can fully comprehend. Mass starvation, disease, systematic killing." The women stirred uneasily. Some had heard whispers of such things, rumors quickly suppressed by authorities. Others had genuinely believed they were fighting a defensive war, protecting Germany from aggression, and knew nothing of what had been done in their country's name. "I'm telling you this," Captain Mitchell continued, "because you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to understand what your government did while telling you that you were serving a noble cause. And because when the war ends, you will have to return to a Germany that must face these crimes and rebuild from them." Irma felt her stomach turn. She had lost her husband at Stalingrad, had served what she believed was her duty to her country. But if what Captain Mitchell said was true, if Germany had built camps designed not just to imprison, but to exterminate, then what had she been serving? What had Kurt died for? Anna's face had gone pale. "How can we believe you?" she asked quietly. "How do we know this isn't propaganda, like what they told us about you?" Captain Mitchell nodded, as if she had expected this question. "You can't know for certain, not yet. But ask yourselves this. Have we treated you the way you were told Americans would? Have we starved you, beaten you, shown you cruelty, or have we fed you meatloaf and gravy?" The revelation about the camps cast a shadow over the compound that lasted for weeks. The women withdrew into themselves again, not from distrust of the Americans but from the weight of what they were beginning to understand about their own country. Irma spent hours lying on her cot, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the Germany she had loved with the Germany that Captain Mitchell described. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the routine of camp life pulled them back into connection with their surroundings. The need for human contact, for conversation and companionship, proved stronger than the desire to retreat into isolation. By late January, mealtimes had transformed completely from those first silent, segregated weeks. The German women no longer clustered exclusively at their own tables. Some still preferred to sit together, but others began accepting invitations from guards to share meals and practice English. Private Whitmore became a favorite conversation partner, his patience with their broken English and his genuine interest in their lives making him approachable in ways the other guards were not. Anna had become particularly bold in her interactions. Her natural facility with languages, combined with daily practice, meant her English improved rapidly. She began translating not just words but cultural concepts, helping bridge the gap between two very different worlds. At lunch one day, she explained to Thomas the cook why German bread was so different from American bread, the importance of rye and darkness and density in German baking tradition. Thomas listened with genuine interest, then surprised everyone by producing a recipe book the next day. My grandmother, he explained through Anna's translation, came from Bavaria. She brought recipes with her. Maybe we can make some German bread? Help you feel less homesick? The gesture moved the women more than any official kindness could have. This wasn't protocol or duty. This was a man reaching across the divide of war to offer comfort through the universal language of food. Several of the women who had baking experience volunteered to help, and soon the camp kitchen became a place of cultural exchange rather than just sustenance. Irma found herself drawn into these activities almost against her will. She had maintained her distance longer than most, her natural caution and leadership position making her more reserved. But watching Anna and the others laugh with Thomas over a failed attempt at Stalin, seeing Private Whitmore earnestly practicing German pronunciation with Helga, she felt her resistance weakening. One evening at dinner, Private Whitmore sat down across from Irma without asking permission. He placed 2 plates on the table, both laden with food. "You eat?" he asked in German, then switched to English. "You never take seconds, always watching everyone else. Tonight, you eat more." Irma looked at him, this young man with his honest face and kind eyes, and felt something crack inside her chest. "Why do you care?" she asked in careful English. "We are enemies." He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "My mother," he finally said slowly, so she could understand. "She says, war makes enemies of strangers. But people are just people. You are someone's daughter, someone's sister, maybe someone's mother. Why would I want you to be hungry?" The simplicity of his statement, the fundamental decency it represented, overwhelmed her. She had spent years believing that strength meant hardness, that loyalty meant hatred of the enemy, that service required the suppression of ordinary human kindness. But here was this American boy, barely old enough to shave, offering her food and dignity simply because it was right. February brought the first letters from Germany. They arrived in bundles, sorted by the Red Cross, censored by both German and American authorities, their contents reduced to fragments of news that had survived multiple inspections. Captain Mitchell distributed them personally, understanding the weight these thin envelopes carried. Irma's hands trembled as she accepted the letter addressed in her sister's handwriting. She sat on her cot, unable to open it immediately, afraid of what words might be contained inside. Around her, other women experienced similar hesitation. Some tore their letters open immediately, desperate for any connection to home. Others, like Irma, waited, steeling themselves for news they might not want to receive. Finally, she slid her finger under the envelope's seal. The letter was dated December 15th, written more than 2 months ago. Her sister's handwriting was shakier than she remembered. The words cramped, as if paper were scarce. "Dearest Irma," it began, "Mother and I are alive. Our building still stands, though many around us have fallen. We received word that you were captured but safe, and we thanked God for small mercies. Berlin is not the city you remember. There is little food, less heat, and no hope that things will improve soon. The war is lost, Irma. Everyone knows it now, though few will say it aloud. We pray only that it ends before there is nothing left to rebuild." The letter continued with small details of daily survival, the struggle to find bread, the sharing of coal among neighbors, the constant fear of bombers. But what struck Irma most was a single line near the end. "We are ashamed of what has been done in Germany's name. When you return, you will find a country that must learn to live with its sins." Anna's letter brought no such relief. She read it once, then again, her face draining of color. When she finally looked up, her eyes were hollow. "My mother's building was destroyed in November," she said quietly to Irma. "My brother was killed in the rubble. My mother survived but lost her right arm. She's living with my aunt now, in a cellar, because the upper floors are gone." Other women shared similar stories. Homes destroyed, family members dead or missing, cities reduced to rubble. The Germany they had left behind was being systematically erased, and the Germany that would emerge from the ashes was uncertain and frightening. But mixed with the grief was something else, a growing awareness that perhaps their captivity had saved them from worse fates. Here, they were warm and fed. They slept in beds with blankets. They received medical care. They lived without fear of bombs falling through the ceiling in the middle of the night. The bitter irony was not lost on any of them. That evening, the mess hall was quieter than it had been in weeks. Even the Americans seemed to sense the weight of the news from home. Private Whitmore moved among the tables more gently than usual, his usual cheerfulness subdued. When he reached Irma's table, he simply placed a hand on her shoulder briefly, a gesture of comfort that required no translation. Anna pushed her food around her plate, unable to eat. "How do we go back to that?" she whispered. "How do we return to a country that's been destroyed?" Irma had no answer. She thought about her sister's words, about shame and sin and rebuilding. She thought about meatloaf and gravy, about kindness from unexpected sources, about the vast distance between what she had believed and what she now knew to be true. March brought the first hints of spring and an unexpected proposal. Captain Mitchell approached Irma one afternoon with a request that caught her completely off guard. "We're planning an Easter celebration," the translator conveyed. "We would like the German women to participate in the planning, to share your traditions with us, as we shared ours at Christmas." Irma's first instinct was to refuse. It felt wrong somehow, inappropriate to celebrate with their captors. But when she looked around at the other women, she saw something in their faces that made her reconsider. They were hungry for purpose, for meaning, for something beyond the monotonous routine of captivity. They needed to feel useful again, to create, rather than simply exist. "What do you want us to do?" Irma asked carefully. "Whatever feels right to you," Captain Mitchell replied through the translator. "Decorations, music, food traditions, whatever would make this feel like a proper holiday." Over the following weeks, the camp transformed into something resembling a community project. The women taught American guards how to create traditional German Easter decorations, painting eggs with intricate designs using techniques passed down through generations. Thomas the cook worked with Anna and several others to create German Easter breads, the kitchen filled with the scent of yeast and cardamom that reminded the women achingly of home. Private Whitmore proved surprisingly artistic, carefully following instructions to create paper cutouts in traditional German designs. He worked alongside Helga. The two of them bent over their projects, conversing in a mixture of German and English that somehow communicated more than either language alone could manage. The preparation brought unexpected joy. Women who had barely smiled in months found themselves laughing at botched attempts to explain recipes or demonstrate crafts. The barriers between prisoner and guard continued to dissolve, replaced by something that almost resembled friendship. Easter Sunday arrived warm and bright, the New Hampshire countryside bursting with new growth. Captain Mitchell had arranged for a chaplain to conduct a service, and she invited the German women to participate if they wished. More than half chose to attend, hungry for the ritual and comfort of familiar prayers, even in a foreign place. The meal that followed was different from Christmas. There was less formality, less uncertainty. The German women had contributed to the menu, and alongside traditional American dishes were German specialties they had helped prepare. The meatloaf appeared again, but this time the women understood what it represented. Not a grand feast, but the everyday abundance of American life. Anna sat between Private Whitmore and Thomas, translating their conversation about the differences between American and German cooking traditions. She laughed freely now, her earlier grief and fear replaced by something approaching contentment. She caught Irma's eye across the table and smiled. A question in that smile. "Is this allowed? Can we be happy here?" Irma smiled back, giving permission she wasn't sure she had the right to give. But watching the women around her, seeing them engaged and animated and alive in ways they hadn't been since capture, she understood that survival required more than just breathing. It required hope. Captain Mitchell stood to offer a toast. "To new beginnings," she said simply, "and to the belief that even in wartime, humanity can prevail." The women raised their glasses, the words resonating in ways that would have been impossible just months before. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came over the camp's loudspeakers early in the morning, the words both expected and somehow shocking in their finality. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. The German women gathered in the barracks, uncertain how to respond. Relief mingled with grief, hope tangled with fear. The war that had consumed their lives, that had taken husbands and brothers and fathers, that had shaped every decision they had made for years, was finally finished. But what came next was terrifyingly unclear. Captain Mitchell called an assembly that afternoon. The women filed into the mess hall, their faces solemn, their movements careful. They had lived in this strange limbo for 6 months, prisoners but also somehow guests, enemies but also humans deserving of dignity. Now that status would change, and none of them knew what their future held. "The war is over," Captain Mitchell began, her translator speaking the words with careful precision. "Within the next few weeks, arrangements will be made for your repatriation to Germany. You will be processed through displacement centers and eventually returned to your homes, or what remains of them." The words hung in the air. Return to Germany. Return to bombed cities and starving populations, to a country defeated and occupied, to shame and reconstruction and an uncertain future. The women looked at each other, the same questions reflected in every face. "However," Captain Mitchell continued, and something in her tone made everyone lean forward slightly, "there is another option. The United States government has established a program for certain displaced persons to apply for permission to remain in America. Given your circumstances, your cooperation during captivity, and the skills many of you possess, you would be eligible to apply." Silence. Complete, stunned silence. The possibility of staying in America had never occurred to most of them. They were prisoners of war, enemy combatants. Why would America want them to stay? Anna was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "We could stay here? Live in America?" "It would not be simple," Captain Mitchell said honestly. "There would be a lengthy application process, investigations into your backgrounds, requirements that you learn English fluently and demonstrate ability to support yourselves. But yes, if approved, you could remain as immigrants and eventually apply for citizenship." Irma's mind raced. Stay in America? Abandon Germany, her mother, her sister, everything she had known? But what was there to return to? A destroyed city, a shamed nation, a future of hunger and hardship. Here, she had seen abundance, kindness, opportunity. Here, she had learned that the enemy wasn't what she had been taught to believe. Private Whitmore stood near the wall, watching the women process this information. When Anna looked at him questioningly, he nodded encouragingly, as if to say, "You belong here. If you want to. You don't have to decide immediately," Captain Mitchell said. "You have 2 weeks to consider. Talk among yourselves. Think about what you want your future to be. This choice is yours, and yours alone." That night, the barracks buzzed with whispered conversations that lasted until dawn. Some women knew immediately they wanted to return home, couldn't imagine abandoning their families despite the hardships. Others felt pulled toward America, toward the possibility of starting fresh in a place without ghosts. The 2 weeks of decision-making were the longest of Irma's life. She spent hours walking the perimeter of the compound, thinking about everything that had happened since that cold November day, when they first arrived. She thought about her initial fear and distrust, about Private Whitmore's kindness during Anna's illness, about the Christmas meal that had changed everything. That meatloaf, that simple ordinary dish that they had mistaken for a grand holiday feast, it had become the symbol of everything they had learned during their captivity. The misunderstanding had revealed the vast gulf between propaganda and reality, between what they had been taught about America and what America actually was. Anna had made her decision quickly. She would stay. Her mother, in her letter, had encouraged it. "There is nothing for you here but rubble and shame," she had written. "If you have a chance for a better life, take it. Live well enough for both of us." The loss of her brother, the destruction of her childhood home, had severed many of the ties that might have pulled her back. But for Irma, the choice was more complicated. Her mother and sister were alive, struggling but surviving. How could she abandon them? Yet, what could she offer them by returning? Another mouth to feed in a starving city, another person to share the burden of guilt and reconstruction. Wouldn't she serve them better by building a life here, by sending help when Germany stabilized enough to accept it? She sought out Private Whitmore one afternoon, finding him on duty near the barracks. "Can I ask you something?" she said in English that had improved dramatically over the months. "Of course," he replied, setting down his clipboard. "Why did you help us? That first time, when Anna was sick. You didn't have to. We were enemies." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "My grandmother came from Ireland during the famine," he finally said. "She told me stories about arriving in America with nothing, about how kind strangers helped her survive. She said, "That's what makes America special. Not wealth or power, but the belief that everyone deserves a chance to start over. When I saw Anna sick, I just saw someone who needed help. Not an enemy. Just a person." His words settled something in Irma's chest. This was the essential difference she had discovered. In Germany, she had been taught that strength meant hardness, that loyalty required hatred, that service demanded the suppression of ordinary human compassion. But here, she had learned that true strength could be gentle, that loyalty to humanity might supersede loyalty to nations, that service to others was the highest calling. That evening, she sat down to write 2 letters. One to her sister, explaining her decision to stay and promising to help from across the ocean once she was able. One to Captain Mitchell, formally applying to remain in America. As she wrote, she thought about meatloaf and gravy, about how a simple misunderstanding had opened her eyes to truth, about how food, the most basic human need, had become a bridge between enemies, about how discovering that Americans ate well every day had forced her to question everything she thought she knew. The weight of that meatloaf, she realized, was the weight of transformation itself. 20 years later, Irma Hoffman Henderson stood in the kitchen of her modest home in Worcester, Massachusetts, preparing dinner for her family. Her husband Robert, a kind accountant she had met at a church social in 1948, would be home soon. Her 2 daughters, 12-year-old Margaret and 10-year-old Ruth, were doing homework at the dining table, their English accents carrying no trace of their mother's German origins. In the oven, a meatloaf was baking. The smell filled the house with warmth and comfort, just as it did every Thursday evening. Irma smiled as she prepared the gravy, thinking about how far she had come from that Christmas Eve when she first tasted this dish and believed it was reserved for grand celebrations. She had learned to make it well over the years, following Thomas's recipe that he had written out for her before she left Camp Stark. But every time she served it, she remembered what it represented. Not just food, but the beginning of her understanding that the world was larger and more complex than propaganda had allowed her to believe. Anna lived nearby now, working as a nurse at Worcester General Hospital. She had married Private Whitmore, whose first name they finally learned was Michael, in 1947. They had 3 children and a house with a garden where Anna grew German flowers alongside American roses. The 2 women remained as close as sisters, bound by shared history and the choices they had made together. Not all the women had chosen to stay. 15 had returned to Germany, driven by family obligations or inability to imagine themselves anywhere else. Irma heard from some of them occasionally through letters that described the long, difficult process of rebuilding a shattered nation. They spoke of guilt and shame, but also of small triumphs and gradual healing. Some had become leaders in German-American friendship societies, working to ensure that the bonds forged in places like Camp Stark would continue to grow. Captain Mitchell had retired from military service and occasionally visited Worcester, always welcomed warmly by the women whose lives she had helped transform. She said their story had influenced her entire career, had taught her that treating people with dignity and respect was not weakness, but the strongest form of strength. As Irma set the table, Margaret asked the question she asked every Thursday. "Why do we always have meatloaf on Thursdays, Mama?" Irma sat down with her daughters, smoothing her apron. "Because it reminds me of an important lesson," she said. "When I first came to America, I was afraid and suspicious. I thought this country was my enemy. But then someone served me meatloaf and gravy, and I thought it was the most special food I had ever tasted, saved only for holidays. When I learned that ordinary American families ate like this, and every week, it changed everything I believed." She paused, making sure her daughters understood. "That meatloaf taught me that I had been lied to about many things. It taught me that abundance and kindness weren't weaknesses, but strengths. It taught me that home isn't always where you're born, but where you choose to build a life based on truth and love." Robert arrived home, kissing Irma's cheek as he hung up his coat. The family gathered around the table, the meatloaf placed in the center like the blessing it had always been. As Irma poured gravy over each slice, she thought about that young woman who had arrived at Camp Stark 20 years ago, frightened and lost and certain she knew how the world worked. That woman had been wrong about almost everything, and that wrongness had saved her life.